The Gardener of Willow Creek. Chapter 1. The Disturbance. Arthur Art Penhaligon, a man whose 82 years had etched a roadmap of experience onto his face, sat quietly on a weathered park bench. He sipped his Earl Grey from a thermos, the steam swirling gently in the crisp morning air. Willow Creek Park was his sanctuary, a small oasis in the heart of a rapidly changing city. He came here every morning, same time, same bench. It was routine, comfort, and a connection to a simpler past. The sun, still low on the horizon, cast long shadows through the trees, dappling the path with golden light. Birds chirped their morning melodies, a symphony that always soothed Art's soul. He watched a squirrel dart across the grass, its bushy tail twitching with playful energy. This tranquility was shattered by the abrupt arrival of Officer Kevin Mallory, his crisp uniform and polished boots a stark contrast to the park's gentle disarray. Mallory, a man barely past 30, exuded an air of self-importance that rubbed Art the wrong way. "You can't be here, old man," Mallory barked, his voice jarringly loud in the peaceful setting. Art slowly lowered his thermos. "Excuse me, officer?" His voice, though aged, still held a hint of the steel that had defined his younger years. "Park's closed for renovations. Didn't you see the signs?" Mallory gestured vaguely toward the entrance, not bothering to make eye contact. Art's brow furrowed. He hadn't seen any signs, and he'd walked the same route every day for years. "I haven't. And I've been coming here every morning for a very long time. Doesn't matter. You're trespassing. Gotta move along." Mallory's tone was dismissive, his eyes scanning the park as if looking for something more interesting to occupy his time. A flicker of annoyance sparked within Art. He was a law-abiding citizen, a man who believed in respect for authority. But this felt wrong, arbitrary. "I'm not bothering anyone. Just having my tea." Mallory sighed, a dramatic sound that seemed designed to convey his immense burden. "Look, I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. You gotta go." "Perhaps a little courtesy wouldn't hurt, officer," Art said, his voice rising slightly. He wasn't a man used to being spoken to in such a manner. That seemed to be the wrong thing to say. Mallory's face hardened. "Are you questioning my authority? I am simply asking for a little respect." Mallory took a step closer, his posture becoming more aggressive. "Respect is earned, old man. And you're not earning any right now. Now, are you going to leave peacefully, or am I going to have to escort you off the property?" Art's heart began to pound. He wasn't a young man anymore, and the threat in Mallory's voice was palpable. He felt a surge of anger, mixed with a growing sense of injustice. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just an old man enjoying his morning ritual. As the argument escalated, a shadow detached itself from a nearby tree. A young woman, her face obscured by a baseball cap, was recording the interaction on her phone. Mallory, seemingly oblivious, continued his tirade. "You know, you're obstructing a police officer. That's a serious offense." "I'm not obstructing anything. I'm standing here," Art retorted, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and indignation. Mallory reached for his handcuffs. "That's it. You're under arrest." The speed of the escalation was shocking. Art felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. He tried to stand, to defend himself, but his aged body couldn't react fast enough. Mallory grabbed his arm, twisting it painfully behind his back. "I haven't done anything," Art cried out, the pain shooting through his shoulder. Mallory ignored his pleas, shoving him roughly towards the park exit. Art stumbled, his thermos falling to the ground and shattering. The scent of Earl Grey filled the air, a bitter reminder of the peace that had been so abruptly shattered. As Art was being led away, he glanced back at the park. His sanctuary. He saw the young woman with the phone still recording. A small spark of hope flickered within him. Maybe, just maybe, someone would believe him. That morning, Arthur Penhaligon's world changed forever. His quiet life, filled with routine and simple pleasures, was about to be thrown into chaos. He was about to become a symbol, a lightning rod for a community simmering with discontent. He just didn't know it yet. Chapter 2. The Aftermath. The booking room at the Willow Creek Police Station was a sterile, unwelcoming place. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and stale coffee. Art sat on a hard plastic chair, his wrists chafed by the handcuffs. His shoulder throbbed with pain. He felt disoriented, confused. He was 82 years old. He'd never been arrested in his life. He kept replaying the events in his mind, trying to understand what he had done to warrant such treatment. He was eventually led to a small interrogation room. Detective Reynolds, a woman with weary eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, sat across from him. "Mr. Penhaligon," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm Detective Reynolds. I need to ask you a few questions." Art nodded, his throat dry. I don't understand what's happening. You were arrested for trespassing and obstructing a police officer. But I wasn't. I was just having my tea in the park." Reynolds sighed. "Officer Mallory claims you refused to leave when asked and became verbally aggressive." Art shook his head vehemently. "That's not true. He was the one who was aggressive. I was just trying to explain that I didn't see any signs." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Do you have any witnesses?" Art thought of the young woman with the phone. I think someone was recording." "A young woman. She was near the trees." Reynolds made a note in her pad. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, I need you to answer my questions." The interrogation dragged on for what seemed like hours. Reynolds asked the same questions repeatedly, trying to catch Art in a contradiction. He answered truthfully, but he could sense that she didn't believe him. He was just an old man, after all. Who would believe him over a police officer? Eventually, he was released on bail. His granddaughter, Sarah, a fiery young lawyer, arrived at the station to pick him up. Her face was a mask of fury. "Grandpa, are you okay? What happened?" Art leaned heavily on her arm as they walked out of the station. "I'm all right, Sarah. Just shaken up." "Shaken up? They arrested you. I can't believe this. I'm going to sue them." Art squeezed her hand. "Easy, Sarah. Let's just get home first." Back at his small, cluttered apartment, Sarah examined his injuries. His shoulder was bruised, and his wrist was red and swollen. "This is outrageous," she exclaimed, pacing the room. "They can't just do this. It's abuse of power." "I know, dear. I know." Art sat down heavily on his worn armchair, feeling the weight of the day crashing down on him. "I'm going to find that video," Sarah said, grabbing her laptop. "We need proof of what happened." She spent hours searching online, scouring social media, and contacting local news outlets. Finally, late that night, she found it. The video, shaky and grainy, clearly showed Mallory's aggression and Art's calm demeanor. "I've got it, Grandpa. I've got the proof," Sarah cried, tears welling up in her eyes. Art watched the video, his heart aching with a mixture of anger and relief. He finally had a chance to clear his name. But he also knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult fight. That night, Art couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, his mind racing. He thought about his life, his past, his struggles. He had always tried to do the right thing, to live an honest and decent life. And now, in his twilight years, he was being accused of something he didn't do. He knew he couldn't let this go. He had to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been unfairly targeted by those in power. He had to show them that even an old man could stand up for what was right. As the first rays of dawn crept through his window, Art made a decision. He would fight. He would clear his name. And he would expose the corruption that had allowed this to happen. He was just a gardener, a simple man who loved his routine and his Earl Grey tea. But he was also a man of principle, a man of unwavering resolve. And he was ready to fight for his dignity. Chapter 3, The Uprising. The video went viral. It was shared and retweeted thousands of times, sparking outrage and debate. The hashtag Justice for Art became a rallying cry. People were angry. They were tired of seeing innocent people targeted by police brutality. They were tired of the abuse of power. And they were ready to take a stand. Sarah, with her legal expertise and her passion for justice, became Art's de facto spokesperson. She organized protests, gave interviews, and filed a formal complaint against Officer Mallory. The local news media picked up the story, and Art's case became a cause célèbre. He was invited to speak at rallies, where he shared his story and inspired others to fight for their rights. "I'm just an old man," he would say, his voice raspy but firm. "But I believe in justice. And I believe that we can make a difference. We just have to stand together and fight for what's right." The community rallied around Art. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers came forward to offer their support. They organized fundraising events to help pay for his legal fees. They wrote letters to the police department and the city council. They showed up at protests with signs and banners. But the support wasn't universal. There were those who defended Officer Mallory, who accused Art of being a troublemaker, who dismissed the video as fake news. They argued that the police were just doing their job, and that Art should have followed their instructions. The city government, initially silent, began to feel the pressure. The mayor, facing a growing public outcry, announced that an internal investigation would be conducted into the incident. Officer Mallory was placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. He lawyered up and refused to comment on the case. The investigation dragged on for weeks. Art and Sarah grew increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of progress. They felt like the city was trying to bury the story to protect its own. Meanwhile, the protests continued. They grew larger and more frequent, attracting people from all walks of life. The park, the site of Art's initial arrest, became a focal point for the demonstrations. One evening, during a particularly large protest, a group of activists staged a sit-in in front of the police station. They demanded that Officer Mallory be fired and that the city implement reforms to prevent future incidents of police brutality. The police responded with force, arresting dozens of protesters. The scene turned chaotic, with tear gas and pepper spray filling the air. Art, who was present at the protest, was caught in the middle of the melee. He was knocked to the ground and trampled by the crowd. Sarah rushed to his side, shielding him from the chaos. "Grandpa, are you okay?" Art was shaken but unharmed. He looked around at the scene, his heart heavy with sadness and anger. He had hoped that his case would bring people together, but it seemed to be tearing the community apart. Despite the violence, the protests continued. The community was determined to keep the pressure on the city until justice was served. In the midst of the chaos, a new voice emerged. Maria Rodriguez, a young activist who had witnessed Art's arrest, became a leader in the movement. She was articulate, passionate, and fearless. She organized rallies, spoke at public forums, and challenged the city government to take action. Maria and Sarah became allies, working together to amplify Art's message and to fight for justice. They were an unlikely pair, a young lawyer and a seasoned activist, but they shared a common goal: to create a better world for everyone. As the movement gained momentum, Art began to see a glimmer of hope. He knew that the fight was far from over, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had the support of his family, his friends, and a growing community of people who believed in justice. He was still just a gardener, an old man who loved his routine and his Earl Grey tea. But he was also a symbol of hope, a beacon of resistance against injustice. And he was ready to keep fighting, no matter what. Chapter 4: The Trial. The trial of Arthur Penhaligon versus the city of Willow Creek became a media circus. Reporters from across the country descended on the small town, eager to cover the David versus Goliath story. The courtroom was packed every day, filled with supporters, protesters, and curious onlookers. The atmosphere was tense and electric. Sarah, representing her grandfather, faced a formidable opponent in the city's top lawyer, Mr. Harrison, a man known for his sharp wit and his ruthless tactics. The prosecution argued that Art had been trespassing on city property and had resisted arrest. They presented Officer Mallory as a dedicated public servant who was simply doing his job. Sarah, in her opening statement, painted a different picture. She argued that Art had been unfairly targeted by Officer Mallory, who had abused his power and violated her grandfather's civil rights. The key evidence in the case was the video. Sarah played it for the jury, highlighting Officer Mallory's aggression and Art's calm demeanor. She also presented testimony from witnesses who had seen the incident, corroborating Art's version of events. Mr. Harrison, in his cross-examination of Art, tried to paint him as a stubborn and argumentative old man. He questioned his memory and his credibility. But Art remained calm and composed. He answered the questions honestly and respectfully, refusing to be baited into an argument. "I'm not a perfect man," he admitted on the stand. "But I'm an honest man, and I did nothing wrong that day in the park." The trial lasted for 2 weeks. The jury heard testimony from a wide range of witnesses, including Officer Mallory, Detective Reynolds, Maria Rodriguez, and several residents of Willow Creek. Officer Mallory, on the stand, maintained that he had acted appropriately. He claimed that Art had been aggressive and uncooperative, and that he had been forced to use force to subdue him. However, his testimony was contradicted by the video and by the testimony of several witnesses. He appeared nervous and defensive, and his credibility was severely damaged. Detective Reynolds, in her testimony, admitted that the internal investigation had found some inconsistencies in Officer Mallory's account of the events. However, she maintained that there was no evidence of wrongdoing. Maria Rodriguez, in her testimony, described how she had witnessed Art's arrest. She testified that Officer Mallory had been unnecessarily aggressive and that Art had done nothing to provoke him. "I saw what happened that day," she said, her voice filled with passion. "And it was wrong. Mr. Penhaligon is a good man. He deserves justice." As the trial drew to a close, both sides presented their closing arguments. Mr. Harrison, in his closing argument, urged the jury to consider the evidence carefully and to remember that the police were there to protect and serve the community. Sarah, in her closing argument, implored the jury to stand up for justice and to send a message that police brutality would not be tolerated. "This case is not just about my grandfather," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's about all of us. It's about whether we are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. It's about whether we are willing to hold those in power accountable for their actions." The jury deliberated for 3 days. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Finally, the verdict came. The jury found in favor of Art Penhaligon. They awarded him a substantial sum in damages. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Art hugged Sarah tightly, tears streaming down his face. Justice had been served. Chapter 5: Scars and Resilience. The legal victory was a monumental step, but it didn't erase the scars left by the ordeal. Art found himself grappling with PTSD, the image of Mallory's aggressive face, and the feeling of the handcuffs on his wrists replaying in his mind at night. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the park bench feeling like a distant memory. Sarah, too, felt the weight of the battle. She had poured her heart and soul into the case, neglecting her own life and career. She felt drained and exhausted, but also immensely proud of what she had accomplished. The money from the lawsuit helped Art financially, but it couldn't buy back the peace of mind he had lost. He found it difficult to trust people, especially those in positions of authority. He became withdrawn and isolated, spending most of his time alone in his apartment. Maria, on the other hand, continued her activism, using Art's case as a platform to advocate for police reform and social justice. She organized workshops, led protests, and worked with community leaders to develop strategies for addressing systemic inequities. One day, Maria visited Art at his apartment. She found him sitting in his armchair, staring blankly out the window. "Art," she said softly, "how are you doing?" Art turned to her, his eyes filled with sadness. I'm not doing so well, Maria. I keep thinking about what happened. I can't seem to shake it off." Maria sat down next to him and took his hand. "I know it's hard, Art, but you're not alone. We're all here for you." "But what was it all for?" Art asked, his voice trembling. "Did it even matter? Will it really change anything?" Maria squeezed his hand. "It mattered, Art. It mattered a lot. You inspired so many people to stand up for what's right. You showed us that even an old man can make a difference." "But I'm so tired," Art said. "I just want to be left alone." Maria nodded. "I understand. But you can't give up now. We need you. The community needs you." Art looked at Maria, his eyes searching hers. "What can I do?" "Just keep being you, Art," Maria said. "Keep sharing your story. Keep inspiring us with your courage. That's all we ask." Art thought about what Maria had said. He realized that he couldn't let the experience define him. He had to find a way to move forward, to heal, and to use his voice to make a positive impact on the world. He decided to start small. He began volunteering at a local community center, helping to teach gardening to underprivileged children. He found solace in working with his hands, nurturing life, and sharing his knowledge with others. He also started writing. He wrote about his experiences, his struggles, his hopes, and his dreams. He shared his writing with friends and family, and eventually, he published a small book. His book became a local bestseller, and he was invited to speak at schools, libraries, and community events. He shared his story with a wider audience, inspiring others to overcome adversity and to fight for justice. Slowly but surely, Art began to heal. He found purpose and meaning in his life again. He realized that the experience had changed him, but it hadn't broken him. He was stronger and more resilient than ever before. One day, he returned to Willow Creek Park. He sat on his old bench, sipped his Earl Grey tea, and watched the birds sing. He felt a sense of peace wash over him. The park was still his sanctuary. It was a reminder of the past, but also a symbol of hope for the future. He knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but he also knew that he was ready to keep fighting, one day at a time. He was still the gardener of Willow Creek, nurturing hope and resilience in a world that desperately needed it. Chapter 6. Echoes of the Future. Years passed. The changes Art fought for were incremental, but palpable. The Willow Creek Police Department underwent sensitivity training and implemented new de-escalation tactics. The City Council established a civilian oversight committee to review police conduct. But the most significant change was the shift in the community's consciousness. People were more aware of their rights, more willing to speak out against injustice, and more engaged in the political process. Art, now in his late 80s, had become a local legend. He was frequently stopped on the street by people who wanted to shake his hand or thank him for his courage. He received numerous awards and accolades, but he always remained humble and grounded. Sarah continued her legal career, specializing in civil rights cases. She became a champion for the underdog, fighting for the rights of the marginalized and the oppressed. She attributed her success to the lessons she had learned from her grandfather. Maria continued her activism, expanding her reach and influence. She became a national voice for social justice, advocating for policy changes at the state and federal levels. She never forgot Art's story, and she often cited him as an inspiration. One afternoon, Art received a phone call from a young man named David. David was a student at Willow Creek High School, and he was working on a history project about the impact of Art's case on the community. "Mr. Penhaligon," David said, his voice filled with excitement. "I'm so honored to be speaking with you. Your story has really inspired me. I want to ask you, what do you hope people will learn from your experience?" Art paused for a moment, reflecting on the question. "I hope they will learn that one person can make a difference," he said. "I hope they will learn that it's never too late to stand up for what's right. And I hope they will learn that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope." "Thank you, Mr. Penhaligon," David said. "Your words mean so much to me." Art smiled. "You're welcome, David. And don't ever give up on your dreams. The world needs young people like you to keep fighting for a better future." That night, Art sat on his old bench in Willow Creek Park. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the trees. He sipped his Earl Grey tea and watched the birds sing. He knew that his life was coming to an end, but he also knew that his story would live on. He had planted seeds of hope and resilience in the community, and those seeds would continue to grow and flourish long after he was gone. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace and contentment. He had lived a long and full life, and he had made a difference. He was the gardener of Willow Creek, and he had left the world a little bit better than he found it. Epilogue. Years later, a statue of Arthur Art Penhaligon was erected in Willow Creek Park. The statue depicted him sitting on his old bench, sipping his Earl Grey tea. A plaque at the base of the statue read, "Arthur Penhaligon, a champion of justice, a symbol of hope, and the gardener of Willow Creek." And so, the story of Arthur Penhaligon lived on, inspiring generations to come. His legacy served as a reminder that even the most ordinary person can achieve extraordinary things when they stand up for what they believe in, and that even in the face of adversity, the human spirit can prevail.